Welcome to the Birth of a Nation, Key Moments in Early American History. I'm your host, Johnny Young, and today we step into a world on fire, a world gripped by two global wars and a devastating economic collapse, from the muddy trenches of Europe to the breadlines of the Great Depression. The years between 1914 and 1945 would test the resolve of nations and forge the modern identity of the United States. In this episode, we're exploring the interconnected crises of the World Wars and the Great Depression, a 30-year crucible of global conflict, ideological confrontation, and economic despair. These events did more than redraw borders or realign economies. They redefined the very soul of America, inspiring stories of courage, resilience, and transformation. It's a period of contradictions, innovative and destruction, nationalism and globalism, hope and despair. It begins, as many of history's most defining chapters do, with a single gunshot. The early 20th century dawned with great promise and ominous undercurrents. The world was modernizing rapidly. Automobiles zipped through the cities once paced by horses and carriages. Radios brought the sound of jazz and presidential addresses into living rooms, and skyscrapers clawed towards the heavens. But beneath this glittering progress was a fragile peace. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria set off a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations that would engulf Europe in war. The United States watched from across the Atlantic, reluctant to enter what President Woodrow Wilson dubbed a quarrel in a faraway land. But neutrality would prove short-lived. By 1917, the U.S. joined the conflict, bringing with it fresh troops, industrial might, and a new vision of global leadership. World War I would be known as the war to end all wars, but that grim promise would be broken barely 2 decades later. World War I introduced horrors unseen on any previous battlefield: machine guns, tanks, poison gas, and trench warfare transformed the pace and scale of death. It was a war of attrition, not glory, where progress was measured in inches and lives lost. Nearly 40 million soldiers and civilians died, and entire regions of Europe were reduced to mud, wire, and ruin. Back home, the war transformed American industry, labor, and society. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, helping fuel the war effort. African Americans, too, joined the fight, both overseas and in what came to be known as the Great Migration, seeking better lives in industrial cities of the North. But peace brought new challenges. The 1920s, often remembered as a roaring decade of flappers and stock tickers, also concealed deep fractures in the economy. While the U.S. emerged as a dominant world power, its prosperity was even and speculative. In October 1929, the bottom fell out. The stock market crashed, setting off a financial catastrophe that rippled through every layer of American society. Banks failed, businesses shattered, families lost everything. The 1929 crash was the result of a toxic blend of rampant speculation, buying stocks on margin or borrowed money, and minimal regulation. When confidence faltered, panic selling began. Over $14 billion in wealth vanished in a single day. A staggering blow in an era before federal deposit insurance or central safety net. The Great Depression would become the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in modern history. But it was more than numbers. It was about the human toll. The man who promised a chicken in every pot President Herbert Hoover became a symbol of helplessness. Shanty towns nicknamed Hoovervilles sprang up across the country. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Hope seemed rationed. And as America struggled at home, storm clouds gathered abroad once again. While Franklin Delano Roosevelt would become the face of leadership during this era, Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of First Lady, not as a ceremonial figure, but as an advocate, speaker, and activist. She traveled across the country to witness the suffering firsthand, championed civil rights at a time when it was unpopular, and fought for the poor, the marginalized, and the forgotten. As one journalist wrote, she spoke for those who had no voice. This is the backdrop of our story. A nation reeling from war, struggling through depression, and standing once again on the brink of global conflict. What followed would be a test not just of military strength, but of character, unity, and democracy itself. The drums of war began not with gunfire, but with whispers, echoes across empires, and ambition on the rise. The early 20th century was a powder keg of nationalism, tangled alliances, imperial competition, and technological transformation. In 1914, it only took the squeeze of a trigger in Sarajevo to light the match. But while Europe descended into chaos, the United States stood at the edge of the storm, watching, waiting, and weighing the cost of engagement. Though geographically distant, America was already entangled economically, diplomatically, emotionally. Immigrant families from Germany, Ireland, Poland, Italy, and beyond still clung to memories of their homelands, now embroiled in a global firestorm. But President Woodrow Wilson held firm, neutral in thought as well as in action, he declared. The nation, after all, had its own concerns: industrial growth, labor unrest, and the expanding powers of modern finance. Yet neutrality would prove to be a fragile illusion. June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Within weeks, tangled alliances pulled Europe into war. The Allies, Britain, France, Russia, versus the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire. America, at first, chooses isolation, but economic ties and cultural loyalties begin to test its distance. While Europe turned trenches into graves, America expanded its economies. Banks lent billions to allied nations. Factories boomed with war orders. Wall Street thrived. But the oceans was no barrier to the consequence of conflict. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, turning the seas into hunting grounds. Then came the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Nearly 1,200 lives lost, among them 128 Americans. Though the Lusitania wasn't the official cause for entry, it was the first fracture in the American psyche. By 1917, that fracture would widen into a call to arms. A decoded message, the infamous Zimmerman telegram, revealed Germany urging Mexico to invade the United States in exchange for regaining lost territory. It was an insult, a threat, and a turning point. The Zimmerman telegram was intercepted by British intelligence in January 1917 and proposed a German-Mexican alliance if the U.S. joined the Allies. It promised Mexico the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, and publication of the telegram outraged the American public. In 1917, Congress declared war. Young men, farmers, factory workers, immigrants, and Ivy Leaguers alike answered the call. The U.S. Army swelled from a few 100,000 to over 4 million. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, would soon arrive in France, not to participate in a European war, but to end it. Nicknamed Blackjack, Pershing was a seasoned commander who demanded discipline and independence. He resisted the idea of merging U.S. troops with Allied forces, insisting they fight under American command. His leadership at battles like Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive helped tip the balance of the war. Meanwhile, at home, the war transformed American society. Women filled factories, producing ammunition and uniforms. African Americans from the South joined the Great Migration, heading north for war jobs and new opportunities, even as they faced segregation in the ranks and racism on the street. World War I was a conflict not just of artillery and trenches, but of shifting values and blurred boundaries. For the first time, modern propaganda, national surveillance, and media censorship shaped how Americans saw their country and their enemies. And just as quickly as the war had come, it ended. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Europe lay in ruin. Empires had fallen. The Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs. America had emerged not just victorious, but changed, confident, modern, and powerful. But peace would not last. In Paris, the victors gathered. The Treaty of Versailles redrew borders, blamed Germany, and demanded reparations. It also planted seeds of bitterness and nationalism that would sprout decades later. Wilson championed the League of Nations, a new hope for global diplomacy. But back home, the Senate refused to join. America, once again, turned inward. And in that inward turn, something unexpected happened. A cultural explosion. The Roaring Twenties, era of jazz, flappers, radio, and prohibition. Massive stock market growth, fueled by speculation and debt. Harlem Renaissance reshapes American arts and identity. And consumerism rises. Cars, appliances, fashion, all on credit. The 1920s roared with promise and profit. Wall Street became a temple. Americans chased the dream of endless growth, often on borrowed money. Banks offered easy loans. Stocks soared. The nation believed it was riding an unstoppable wave of prosperity. Until that wave crashed. Charles E. Mitchell, president of the National City Bank, was a symbol of the unchecked speculation of the 1920s. He championed buying stocks on margin and helped fuel the credit bubble. Though later investigated for his role in the crash, he escaped criminal prosecution, a sign of how entangled finance and power had become. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. Panic swept through trading floors, fortunes evaporated, and the American public, drunk on dreams of wealth, awoke to find themselves in economic freefall. Banks failed. Businesses shuttered. Families lost their homes. It wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a spiritual one. The nation's belief in endless progress had been shattered, and what followed would be the longest and most severe economic downturn in American history. Over 5,000 banks failed between 1929 and 1932. Unemployment reached 25% at its peak. Industrial production fell by nearly 50%. Bread lines and soup kitchens became common in major cities. The seeds of the Great Depression had been sown in the euphoria of the 20s, and now they bore bitter fruit. The next decade would test the very foundation of American resilience, and just as the nation began to claw its way back from the brink, storm clouds gathered once again over Europe. It wasn't just the banks that failed in the 1930s. It was faith. Faith in the American promise. Across the heartlands, families stood in lines for food, not for movie tickets. Fathers worked miles in worn-out shoes chasing job leads. Mothers sewed patchwork clothing from old feed sacks. Children grew up fast under the weight of hunger and hardship. The Great Depression wasn't just a statistic. It was a storm that swept through every home, business, and soul. But let's take a look at the human toll of the Depression. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed. Over 2 million men became hobos, riding rail cars in search of work. Over 200,000 children became orphans or were sent to live with relatives. Suicide rates surged, and hope was in short supply. Into that darkness stepped a man with a confident smile and a voice that calmed the nation's nerves. In March 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office and launched what he called bold, persistent experimentation. Polio had left him unable to walk, but it did not cripple his resolve. FDR's fireside chat brought warmth to cold kitchens as he explained banking, relief, and reform to everyday Americans. He was a symbol of hope, pragmatism, and leadership in crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal didn't just hand out charity, it redefined the role of government. The Civilian Conservatory Corps put young men to work building trails and planting forests. The Work Progress Administration built post office, dams, bridges, and schools, many of which still stand today. The Social Security Act gave aging Americans a lifeline. Labor protections were introduced. Banking was regulated. For the first time, Washington became a lifeline rather than a distant institution. But no policy could tame the dust. The Dust Bowl, or America's ecological disaster, from 1930 to 1936, drought ravaged the southern plains. Over-farming and poor soil practices turned fields to dust. Massive dust storms, or black blizzards, choked the skies from Oklahoma to New York. More than 2.5 million people fled the plains, many to California. A singer from Oklahoma, Woody Guthrie, turned hardship into protest song. With the guitar labeled "This Machine Kills Fascists," he sang of migrant workers, poverty, and hope. His voice became the anthem of the forgotten. The images from the Dust Bowl are burned into the American memory. Cracked earth, withered crops, mothers with hollow eyes, children coughing from the air. It was as if nature itself had turned its back on the American dream. But then the world turned again. Far across the ocean, a different storm gathered. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising revival, blaming scapegoats, and rearming a nation humiliated by Versailles. In Italy, Mussolini marched his fascist vision across Africa. In the East, Japan expanded brutally through Manchuria and China. In 1939, the world shattered once again. Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war, and World War II had begun. But America remained neutral, at least officially. The Land-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply weapons and aid to the Allies. American industry quietly shifted to wartime production, and public opinion slowly shifted as Nazi aggression grew. But many still remember World War I and feared another entanglement. Then came the day that changed everything. December 7th, 1941. The rising sun struck Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack killed over 2,400 Americans, destroyed battleships, and pulled the United States into full-scale war. Congress declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The time for isolation was over. America mobilized like never before. Car factories became tank factories. Women replaced men in manufacturing lines, and propaganda posters urged thrift, sacrifice, and unity. Rosie the Riveter, more than a symbol, Rosie represented over 6 million women who entered the workforce during the war. Clad in coveralls and bandanas, they proved that patriotism wasn't about fighting. It was about building, welding, and working towards victory. Ration books controlled sugar, meat, and gasoline. Victory gardens grew in backyards. War bonds raised billions from average citizens. Japanese Americans were forcefully relocated to internment camps under Executive Order 9066. And while war raged abroad, the home front buzzed with intensity, but the war's toll was steep. In Europe, American troops landed on beaches soaked in blood. Normandy, Anzio, Omaha. They marched through forests, bombed cities, and liberated camps of unspeakable horror. In the Pacific, brutal battles like Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa revealed the ferocity of island warfare. The Tuskegee Airmen, African American pilots, proved that courage knew no color. Fighting racism at home and enemies in the sky, they flew over 15,000 sorties in Europe and never lost a bomber to enemy fire. They laid the foundation for the desegregation of the military. The numbers of the war: over 16 million Americans served in World War II. More than 400,000 died. U.S. industrial output supplied over 2/3 of all Allied war material. And World War II cost the U.S. over $300 billion, the equivalents of trillions today. The war ended with fire, first in Berlin, where Hitler fell and the Third Reich collapsed, then in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where 2 atomic bombs changed warfare and humanity forever.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
America waited out World War II's last tense hours. At the White House, President Truman, State Secretary Burns, and Cordell Hull stood by for the momentous surrender message from the Japanese. Radio men, sound and camera crews of worldwide newsreels kept vigil with Washington reporters. Then, after tantalizing hours of rumors and guesses, came the President's historic announcement, August 14th, 1945.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of land. In the reply, there is no qualification.
The greatest news story of all time.
By August 1945, the war was over, but the world had been rewritten. The United States emerged not just victorious, but transformed. It had defeated fascism, expanded its economy, and now stood as a global superpower. But the scars of the Depression and the war would linger, and a new shadow loomed on the horizon: the Cold War. What began as hardship became a crucible. The Great Depression and World War II tested the soul of a nation. and forge something new, a stronger, more unified, and more complex America. On August 15, 1945, the guns had fallen silent. The flags of surrender fluttered in the Pacific winds. Crowds danced in the streets of New York and San Francisco. Strangers kissed. Tears flowed. War was over. But the world that emerged from the rubble was not the same. America stood at a new precipice, not of survival, but of supremacy. The scars of depression and war were still raw, yet a new chapter was beginning. This was the dawn of the American century. And let's take a look at victory by the numbers. Over 400,000 Americans' lives lost in World War II, 75 million killed globally, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities like Warsaw, Tokyo, Berlin, and Manila were reduced to ash. The U.S. produced over 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 12 million rifles during the war. For the first time in modern history, the United States emerged as a global leader, militarily, economically, and morally. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was fractured. The Soviet Union had paid a terrible price in blood, but rose powerful in defiance. Two giants now stared across the ashes of war, and a new rivalry was born. But back home, another battle was already underway. What would peacetime America look like? For the returning veterans, over 16 million Americans that served in the war, when they returned, they carried memories of faraway battles and brotherhood. But they also returned to a home that had changed, and in some cases had not changed enough. For white soldiers, the future was filled with opportunity. For black and brown veterans, it was complicated. They had fought for a nation that still denied them basic rights. To ease the return, Congress passed one of the most transformative laws in American history, the GI Bill. It provided free college tuition for veterans, offered low-interest home loans, supported the business creation and job training, and helped birth the American middle class. The GI Bill turned students into scholars. Veterans became homeowners. Suburbs bloomed. College enrollment quadrupled by 1950. It was a vision of prosperity unlike anything the world had seen. But not all shared equally. Black veterans in the South were often denied benefits. Predatory banks and racist housing policies blocked access to home loans. Historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, were overwhelmed and underfunded. Even as America celebrated victory, inequality persisted, but seeds had been planted, seeds that would later fuel the Civil Rights Revolution. Beyond America's shores, new front lines were forming, not with tanks, but with ideologies. The wartime alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union unraveled almost immediately. Their visions for the world, one capitalist, the other communist, were irreconcilable. George F. Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, Kennan authored the famous Long Telegram in 1946. In it, he warned the Soviet expansionism and recommended a strategy of containment, the first domino in what would become the Cold War. The emergence of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain descended across Eastern Europe. Germany and Berlin were divided, and the United Nations was created to prevent another global war. The nuclear arms race began with the Soviet Union's first bomb in 1949, and the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, sending over $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. The world had moved from global hot war to nuclear cold one, not in the trenches, but in back rooms, boardrooms, and shelters. At home, the economy surged. The war had ended the Great Depression, industries boomed, unemployment plummeted, a wave of consumerism swept the nation. Washing machines, cars, record players, and televisions filled American homes. A new ideal emerged, the American dream. Home ownership, 2 kids, a white picket fence, but beneath the surface, fault lines remained. Women, who made up 35% of the workforce during the war, were pressured to return home. Minorities who gained skills and wages were relegated again to second-class jobs. The baby boom began. Over 76 million children were born between 1946 and 1964. The suburbs exploded. Levittown became a prototype for suburban living. Eleanor Roosevelt, more than First Lady, redefined the role. After the war, she became a delegate to the United Nations. Chairing the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, her legacy extended far beyond wartime speeches into global advocacy and human dignity. The post-war world was a world of contradictions. The U.S. stood for freedom while segregating schools. It preached equality while redlining neighborhoods. It helped rebuild Europe while ignoring poverty in its own cities. But the era left behind a foundation of growth, innovation, and tension. From the ashes of war rose both the hope of democracy and the fear of annihilation. The 20th century would not be peaceful, but it would be driven again and again by the choices made in these defining years. The dust of war had settled, the ration books tucked away, the uniforms folded and placed in attic boxes. But peace was not just an absence of war, it was a story in itself, and America was now its main author. The 1930s and 1940s had torn the American soul like a windstorm through bitter temple, destroying illusions, revealing truth, and strangely, planting new seeds. From bread lines to battlefields, from blackout curtains to ticker tape parades, the journey changed the nation, and that change is still with us. Let's pause. Let's breathe. Let's ask. What legacy did these decades truly leave behind? The 1930s taught America vulnerability. The 1940s taught it power. This dual legacy, humility and dominance, still defines the American identity. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats are gone, but we still long for comfort and leadership. The factory lines of Detroit don't buzz like they once did, but the memory of shared sacrifices shaped how we imagine national unity. The enemy is no longer the Axis, but the echoes of fascism, authoritarianism, and division remain. The everyman soldier was not a general, not a president, just a GI from Kansas, a nurse from Georgia, a welder from Cleveland. These were the architects of histories. They didn't get statues, but they got history's thanks and burdens.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
Today, we fear many things. Economic collapse, global war, political collapse, even each other. But if there's a lesson to be found in the smoke and still of this area, it's that we've been here before, and we endured. The New Deal expanded federal power, and wartime industry made Washington the hub of national planning. World War II marked America's arrival as a world superpower. Social contradictions brought prosperity for many, but exclusion for millions. The rise of the middle class, fueled by the GI Bill and booming post-war economy, In a culture of resilience, the Depression taught survival. The war demanded sacrifice. But there were ghosts, too. Ghosts of promises unfulfilled. The Japanese American families who returned from internment camps to vandalized homes. The black soldiers who returned from Europe's battlefield to Jim Crow's grip. And the women who built the war machine but were pushed back into silence. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster, she was real, in thousands of factories and shipyards. But when the war ended, the call wasn't thank you, it was go home. And many did, but many didn't. The seeds of feminism's second wave were born on the factory floor, beneath the hum of rivet guns and the rhythm of resistance. This episode was about 2 decades, but it was also about 2 Americas, one rising, one reckoning, a land of opportunity and a land of exclusion, a democracy at war and a society struggling with its own contradictions. But here's the truth. History isn't meant to comfort us. It's meant to challenge us. And the Great Depression and World War II, they weren't just chapters. They were tests of our unity, of our values, of our very identity. And though the answers were imperfect, they mattered. If this episode stirs something in you, a question, a connection, a curiosity, I hope you'll sit with it, talk about it, share it. History is not a museum, it's a mirror. And we today are still walking through the shadows and the light cast by the 1930s and 40s. We are children of that crucible, and the world we inherit is one forged in depression, tempered by war, and still evolving. Next time on International Narratives, we dive headlong into the Cold War, where ideology became weapon, alliances were tested, and the line between friend and foe blurred. From Berlin to Korea, Cuba to Vietnam, we explored a long, twisting struggle that reshaped the world. I'm Johnny Young, and this is How a Nation Remembers.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast with others who love history and global stories. Got a correction, a suggestion, or a country you'd like featured? Reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, every nation has a story worth telling.